Hello and good morning. So great to see you. We'll be in 2 Kings, the 5th chapter, 2 Kings chapter 5, just a moment. It's a joy to be with you, to worship God together. We thank you for your presence. It was a Monday, April 15th, 2013, Boston Marathon near its conclusion, 2 separate bombings going off within about 15 minutes of each other. Those bombings killed 3, injured 281. By the end of that week, Thursday the 18th of April into Friday the 19th, they had narrowed in on 2 suspects, the Tsarnaev brothers. They ended up in sort of one elongated shootout in pursuit. The first of those brothers struck multiple times, carried to the nearest trauma center, where he was essentially pronounced dead upon arrival. They worked on him for about 15 minutes, had no shot of surviving. The younger brother, Zaar Tsarnaev, likewise injured traumatically, severely, carried to the same trauma center, the nearest one, where they began to operate on him and treat him. In carrying him to the nearest trauma center, putting him on the floor where they could operate on him and give him the most critical care they could give him, they also were placing him on the same floor as 24 of those 281 victims from the bombing. Imagine being the family members of those victims who were on that floor when the man that's presumed to be responsible for those bombings is now wheeled into that same floor. Imagine being doctors and nurses charged with treating both victims and presumed perpetrator at the same time. What emotions does that build within our hearts? They had to have some high-level organization and security involved. There was a team of 9 nurses that were assigned to his care over the course of the week he was on that floor. They had to run 12-hour shifts. They had to go through FBI checks and all this kind of thing. The head of the nurses actually sat them down and told them, because of the high-profile nature of this, because of the emotional nature of this, we'll give you a choice. You don't have to be assigned to him if it somehow violates some part of your conscience. One of them simply said, I did it. I agreed to help him because I'm a nurse and I don't get to pick and choose my patients. I haven't been able to pick and choose who I've helped in the years leading up to this moment, so I'm not going to begin now. And asked about it looking back, one said she thought this: what will people think about me when they find out I'm treating him? They were having to deal with the clear emotions that were present between treating the man presumed to be responsible for it alongside the people who were victims. That's obvious. There were other things at play that we probably don't necessarily think about at first glance. There's actually a studied sense of VIP bias. When nurses and doctors are treating people with a high-profile personality or a high-profile name, they actually can make mistakes because their emotions about that person impact their standard of care. They can impact their standard of care. So they're dealing with that in addition to the emotions between victim and perpetrator. Additionally, you've got the FBI and other law enforcement involved because they need to interview him. They need him kept alive and kept clear and coherent as much as they can to figure out what exactly happened. So you've got multiple layers of intrigue, of emotion involved. And so she naturally asked, what will people think about me when they find out I'm treating him? Then one of the dads of a victim, he was an amputee. I can't remember if it was just one leg or both legs, but his dad was interviewed about this, and he said he clearly thought this: why did he have to come here? I'm guessing if we hear that question in that setting, we would relate. Why couldn't they have just carried him somewhere else? Well, it's because this was the nearest trauma center and his life was hanging in the balance, and they brought him where he needed to get the best care he could get. We replay those 2 statements on the screen, the two past questions, if we change the setting completely, what if we begin to think about people who are known, even notorious sinners? What if we think about people who have directly hurt us? What if we think about people who we might be afraid could directly hurt us or people we love? Those questions pop into our minds about them. What will people think about me when they find out I'm his or her friend? Or find out that I've invited or brought him or her to worship? What will people think about me? Or we look up in a service, an assembly, and we see a man or a woman here, and we ask this same question: why did he or why did she have to come here? Are there some individuals that we could see us clearly building up some walls of resentment and saying, no, they're not worthy of the gospel? Are there potentially some categories that people would just represent, they're a part of a family, a part of a group, that we could bring ourselves to begin to think these thoughts about those that might be perceived to be enemies? Can the flesh of humanity bring us into a place where we begin to think we're qualified to withhold the salvation God gives and has promised to all who will come to him? What would Jesus say to our thoughts and our questions about what people might think about us or whether or not someone deserves to be here or not? Well, we can know some of the things Jesus would say based on what he did say. One of the most profound but challenging statements that he makes is a parable. Tells it in Matthew 18, retells it with a slightly different perspective in Luke 15. But in Matthew 18, what do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Just hearing the words of that parable, it's challenging enough. We hear it and we might push back against it. Are you really sure that's what you mean? Surely you're kind of exaggerating it because it's a parable, right, Jesus? It's challenging to think that he could say one who's unfaithful and then who repents and comes back is actually more worthy of rejoicing than the 99 who never leave. But I'm afraid we can find a way to bring ourselves a little comfort with this parable as long as we get to decide who the one is. Well, if it's this person or that person who's a good person, who's never wronged me, as long as it's them, well, then I can get behind that. I can rejoice over them repenting. But there's some categories of people, or there are some specific people who've hurt me or my family, and I'm not comfortable extending that one-by-one perspective about them and toward them. Jesus knows that's potentially in our hearts. He knew it was in the hearts of the Jews. He knew they needed to have that hard heart broken. One of the moments when he sees that come to the surface is when he's teaching in Nazareth. And he teaches and reads from the gospel, or reads from the book of Isaiah, and he says, the time is now here for the poor and the blind and the lame to be healed and to be helped. And they try to run him out of town, and he says, Luke chapter 4, verse 24, truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. And then he mentions this widow, not in Israel of old, but in Zarephath. And Elijah goes and he lives with her for a time. She feeds him. He provides a miracle that feeds her and her son. He eventually raises her son from the dead. And so as we discussed last week from that story in 1 Kings 17, we see that for God, everyone matters. Yes, therefore each one matters. And that story of the widow proves that even the most insignificant, seemingly insignificant person, the easiest to fall through the cracks, is never insignificant to God. So just in reviewing that story, because this is the first one Jesus mentioned, What would have happened if Elijah never ended up there and the widow and her son ate one more meal and they starved to death there in the middle of Zarephath? The shorter answer is no one would have noticed. No one would have known. God noticed and knew. God ensured that Elijah ended up at her house. And God fed her through Elijah. So each one mattered. But if you keep reading back in Luke 4 where Jesus is saying, hey, I get it. You don't listen to me because you saw me growing up. I don't have any honor here in my hometown. He's going to convict them by showing them another outsider who heard and was saved and healed by another prophet of God. So it's Luke chapter 4, verse 27. And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. If the widow's life proves that God sees each one, no matter how insignificant we might think they are, Naaman provides a different direction. God's always been this way. God's always loved each one, including those who would be enemies. Northern Kingdom Israel had suffered because of the effects of the northern nation above them, Syria. And yet Naaman, one who had participated in some of that suffering and attacks, is sick. Jesus said he wasn't the only one who was sick. There was plenty inside the borders of Israel. And none of them found cleansing from Elisha, but yet Naaman, this enemy, perceived enemy and even real enemy, does find cleansing from God. So it's with that background, knowing Jesus points us to him to say, God's always had an eye for outsiders, one by one. He invites, he seeks, and he welcomes those who are obedient. Let's remind ourselves of what happens here in 2 Kings 5 before we then apply this to our own lives through its message. 2 Kings 5, look at verse 1. Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was successful. And God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of Judah, had allowed him to be successful, using him to threaten, to warn, to even punish northern kingdom Israel for their disobedience at times. He's a man of great favor because he was successful. The Lord had allowed that to happen. But then keep reading. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now, we probably are pretty convinced that when he is a leper, he's not having the kind that would kill him quickly, that was highly contagious. We don't see it spreading. But it is likely that it's some disease that would have been highly frustrating. It would have kept him from being this commander. It would have cut him off just by nature of debilitating his livelihood. So he has been this mighty commander, but he can no longer continue in that capacity because he's sick. He has this terrible condition. It's a broad term. We don't know exactly what symptoms he has, but he can't continue in this role. But listen to how things continue and shift quickly in verse 2. Now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel. Pause for a minute. What does that mean? All right, verse 1, he's had success. The Lord's given him that success. Well, verse 2 now shows us clearly some of that success has been against this northern kingdom Israel. The people who broke off from the southern kingdom, they're still technically God's people. And the Syrians, through Naaman, have had success against them. He has made himself an enemy of them by raiding them. Now, in detail, one of those raids resulted in capturing this girl, and she ends up living with Naaman's wife. All right, listen to what happens. And she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So the servant girl speaks up and says, "I know a guy." Naaman has access to other prophets and other little g gods here in Syria, but yet they've done nothing for his leprosy. The little servant girl respects him enough to want the best for him, and she says, if only he could get back to my prophet Elisha. Well, that begins the ball rolling. They send word to the king of Syria, hey, this girl is convinced this prophet in Israel can do something. So the king of Syria says, let's give it a try. So he gathers up a large amount of tribute, more than would have been expected, to send to the king of Israel and say, hey, he's coming on good terms, accept our gift, our thanksgiving, and please heal my commander of his sickness. Well, he sends the letter with the sum of riches, and when he arrives with the king of Israel panics. Look at verse 7. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes. He was sad. He was upset. He was grieving. And he said, am I God to kill, to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me. So he panics. He thinks, well, this is a great little ploy. He's going to pretend to be sick, or he sends a sick guy, and under the guise of riches, he's going to let him get in, but he's actually going to attack us from inside. While he's here with the king of Israel, before he is sent back home, Elisha finds out, the prophet. Now, he's not close by. It's probably up to 30 miles away from where this is happening. But he still sends word, let Naaman come to me. So this is verse 8. When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know there is a prophet in Israel. Send him to my house, because here he'll find me having a connection to God, and God can give him the healing that he needs. So when he comes to Elisha, Elisha tells him, sends word back to him, go dip in the Jordan River 7 times. Jordan River was flowing through this area of land. It cuts through. It's highly curvy and winding, in between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. And you'll remember Naaman's response, somewhat famous, right? You mean you're telling me to go dip in that dirty Jordan River? Well, I've got 2 rivers back home, and they're both cleaner than the Jordan. See, further north, the snow melting, the runoff from the mountains, leads them to think their rivers are cleaner. So he objects and he stomps off, and it's as if he thinks he can take God's instructions and carry them back home. But his servants speak up. His servants say, what were you expecting? You thought this was going to be some big show? And he would make this as big as it could be, and he would pronounce you clean, and all would see it, and you would get some sort of attention? But listen to how clear they are when they respond to him. It's verse 13. My father, it is a great word. The prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, wash and be clean? You came here asking for cleansing, and he's told you what to do to get it. Wash and be clean. Why would you object? So upon their intervention, he goes to the Jordan River. He dips. He's submissive. He's not clean after the first, the second, or the 6th time. But after the 7th time, he is cleansed. Look at verse 14. He went down and he dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. He was cleansed from his leprosy. His skin was pure and whole once again. The story, as far as Naaman is concerned, continues, though. Look at verse 15. What's his response? He says, behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. He begins to believe in God. All the gods that he had heard of before, perhaps that he had even followed and worshiped, he now recognizes only this God could heal me. Therefore, only this God will I worship in the future. You drop down 2 verses to 17. If you don't take my tribute, then please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth. For from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any God but the Lord. He understands that not only does their God exist, he is the only God. That all other little g gods are posers, are fakes, are false. That since it's true, God did what God did, it also must be true there are no other gods before him. So it's through this process of him finding the cleansing and submitting that he actually comes to believe in God. Just like the widow does, now he does as well, despite him previously being an enemy of God's people. Now you'll remember, they've got the law by now, and it's in Leviticus chapter 19 that there are a lot of laws about how to treat people. And it's in that section that you have this highly familiar text that Jesus is going to quote from. Leviticus 19, listen, beginning verse 17. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Can you imagine if Naaman comes through and he's asking, well, why did this happen to me? How did it end up that the true God of all the universe, the God of Israel, how did I end up receiving the cleansing that only he could give? They would have to necessarily invoke this promise or this command somehow. That he commands us to love our neighbor. He commands us to love everyone no matter how they have treated us in the past. And so you have two from Israel directly who proved to love their neighbor. The servant girl and Elisha, both being Israelites, love him as themselves. Now I put all four on the screen and then the blanks on purpose. All four shared this common urgency. All right, so the servant girl from Israel, the king of Syria, Elisha from Israel, and Naaman's servants from Syria. They were all four urgently concerned with him finding healing. No matter what they had planned, it changed because he was sick and he needed to find healing. Now, putting all four on the screen and considering all four at one time, I think is highly insightful here. Because we can hear this story and quickly understand why the king of Syria wants him to find healing and why his own servants want him to find healing. That's no surprise. But notice carefully, the two who are not his people, who have actually been on the receiving end of his attacks, they treat him the same as his own people do. They share the same urgency for him finding this healing as the Syrians do. Based on how they treat him, you don't necessarily know who's Syrian and who's an Israelite, because they love him as a person. They love him as they love themselves. Therefore, their urgency is, we've got to get this guy before God so that God can then heal him of his sickness. But as you consider their love for neighbor, loving him as they love themselves, contrast that with the king of Israel. The man who was technically given charge of this nation, he had an urgent concern. So urgent that he was mourning, that he tore his clothes in mourning and grief. Over what? Over his own insecurity and over his perceived lack of safety. Who am I? Am I God? I can't kill. I can't heal. Why would you come to me to ask someone to be healed of leprosy? And of course, the answer to that question is, you technically are supposed to know God. You know the God who does kill. You know the God who does heal. And then he gets paranoid and he says, actually, they're here to attack. They're against me and they're going to attack me. So thinking about someone being an enemy entering his space made him feel so unsafe that he turned against them even further. No, it's a ploy. He's gonna attack me. I'm thinking that a lot of his emotions would mirror those emotions that came to the surface when we heard about the bomber being admitted to the same floor as some of his victims. And perhaps some of those same emotions that we might feel when certain individuals or certain categories of people cross our paths and we think about talking with them about Jesus, but instead we let our resentment, our fear, our insecurity build a wall between us and them. And of course, the conclusion of the story is powerful in the history of this northern kingdom of Israel. Not only does this king reveal himself to be unfaithful, but there are a long line of these northern kingdom kings who refuse to submit to God. God's been clear throughout the law: don't compromise, don't mingle with the peoples around you, and yet they fail to submit. And you have one who is an outsider, and at that, an outsider enemy, and he has a heart that's willing to obey, and he learns the power of obedience and reverence. And I think that's really where Jesus is wanting these people in Nazareth back in Luke 4 to land. That not only did God look out for this widow in Zarephath, and God look out for an enemy in Naaman, they also believed when God did look out for them. And so now that the good news is available to all widows and the good news is available to all enemies, they refuse to believe in Jesus. So seeing his obedience and seeing his repentance should wake us up to overcome any hesitancies we have about those who we might think are not worthy of God's grace through Jesus. Quickly thinking about this through the New Testament lens, how does Jesus prove to have this same heart? How does Jesus model God's seeking and even welcoming of his enemies? Remember that he refused retaliation even when some were actively trying to kill him. That's going to happen here in that Luke 4 text. They run him out of town trying to kill him. He's going to choose to spend time with them in their homes and in public, both, even when they try to test him and trip him up. He knows what they're doing. And he still is in their presence in spite of it. He's around Judas and the 12, the other 11, for some 3 years. He knows that Judas is going to betray him, but even till the very end, the 11 do not know who the traitor is. Think of how well Jesus had to have treated Judas for them to have never had an idea that it was him. Think of how quickly some inference we can make and judge against someone else, even someone we love, say from church or from family, begins to change how we treat a person. And yet Jesus knew he was going to betray him, that Judas was going to betray him, and he never treated him differently to the degree that the others could tell. Of course, Jesus also corrected and rebuked James and John and Luke when they say, well, shouldn't we kill the Samaritans because they rejected us? And Jesus said no. He rebuked them for that. It's out of Samaria. The woman at the well happened. It's out of Samaria that others began to believe at a later date. Then, of course, at the cross, leading up to it, he heals Malchus' ear when Malchus is there to arrest him. And he cries from the cross itself, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. There was no level of antagonistic behavior toward Jesus, against Jesus, that would cause him to say, you're not worthy of the opportunity to be forgiven. The church, of course, mirrors that as well. Acts 4 and 5, you got Peter and John continuing to preach the gospel of Jesus, even though they've been arrested and tried and are beginning to be intimidated. Hey, we'll treat you like we treated Jesus, is the implication. Keep going in Acts chapter 9. Ananias hesitates at first, maybe similar to Naaman. But he listens that Paul is supposed to be, or Saul is supposed to be, this mighty instrument of God's gospel. And Ananias teaches Saul the gospel, and Saul obeys, despite having been one who sought to arrest and then try and have murdered Christians. That person, Saul, of course, goes on to be a mighty instrument of God's hand in spreading the gospel. Peter, in Acts chapter 10, shares the gospel with a centurion, the image of the Roman Empire. Generally, they had a good relationship, but if the Roman Empire ever wanted to flex its muscle militarily, it would bring out men like Cornelius. And Peter went in and shared the gospel with him and his family, and he obeyed the gospel, Acts 10. Acts 16, Paul and Silas are in prison. the jailer who's given charge over them, the one who was meant to intimidate them and keep them in this prison. After the earthquake, they could have fled, but they don't. The jailer goes to kill himself, and they say, don't harm yourself, we're all still here. They have compassion to not flee. They have even more compassion to share with him the gospel, and he and his family are baptized into Christ. The opening verses of Romans 9, Paul, after having been directly mistreated by the very Jews he used to be a part of, that as soon as he begins to preach the gospel, they try to take him out. They try to kill him and arrest him. He opens Romans chapter 9 by saying, I feel so strongly about wanting my brethren to become Christians that I would sacrifice my own soul if I could. That's how much he loved those who had turned themselves against him. And then in an even more profound way, perhaps, or at least a bigger scale way, we think about Paul's relationship to Caesar. Caesar, probably even at the time of Paul, but definitely later, would begin to demand and require of all Roman citizens and those living in its territories, you must worship Caesar as Lord. That's a problem for Christians. Christians could not worship anyone but Lord as Jesus, except for Jesus. And that very man, Caesar, if you do a search, just a quick, simple search in your Bible app, you see all the references of Caesar beginning in chapter 25 of Acts, 25:11. You see that Paul appeals to Caesar. The authorities that are local say, hey, this man's innocent. Had he not appealed to Caesar, we would have let him go. Then the Lord says, I'm going to keep you safe because you must appear before Caesar. The very last instance of the use of the word Caesar in the New Testament is Philippians 4, verse 22. All the saints greet you. All the Christians greet you, especially those in Caesar's household. Sounds as if Paul was able to make it where the gospel could appear before this man who would threaten to divide their loyalty. And some in his household obeyed the gospel. The burden on their heart was for those who were sick, receiving the healing that only God could provide. There was no barrier too high for them to share that message with them. So now we have to keep asking ourselves this question. Will we seek, will we welcome those who view themselves as our enemies, those whom we might view as enemies, those who have hurt us directly, or those who categorically represent some form of opposition? We are going to be hurt, whether by irresponsibility or ignorance or carelessness or even sin. We might even be the direct recipient of someone's wickedness and evil. But when we truly live in the love of God, we recognize that no one can harm us so much to where they no longer are worthy of His love. And when we refuse to believe that, we're refusing the very love He shows toward us. It all starts with that passage that Don read for us this morning from Romans chapter 5. God shows His love for us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. 2 verses later, verse 10, for while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of His Son. It's through that reconciliation we now get to live with Him. None of us were inherently worthy in terms of sin. We're all sacrificed. We gave up that worthiness by sinning. We're inherently worthy because He loves us. He loves us enough to die for us and to give for us. Therefore, we love Him and all who are outside of Him enough to keep the door open, to be able to hear the good news, the cleansing power of God through Jesus Christ. This morning it may be that you are a Christian. You've experienced the joy, the peace of no longer being His enemy, but you've stepped outside of His love. If you know that you need to repent in a public way, please know that He stands to forgive you and will forgive you thoroughly and fully. And we'd love to assist you with that and talking with you and praying with you through that. It may be that you've never enjoyed that relationship, that you need to put Him on in baptism, that you need to respond just as Naaman did, to hear those words, wash and be clean. We'd love to assist you with making that decision this morning as well. If we can help you, know that we love you. God loves you. Would you come as we sing?